Okay, so the more we make this a conversation, the better, I think. Yeah. So what I want to do is do a sort of broad scale provocation up front and also talk about some of the new work we're doing, which will be announced next year, particularly on how do you actually distribute decision making in companies. And I'll make this general comment. A lot of the agile instincts about how we should organize are right, but their methods don't really take account of the science. So that they have an ideological thing that it would be great if we all self-organize, but they don't do the work on how things self-organize in nature and assume therefore it just means we just get together with people we like, which it doesn't. So I want to address some of those issues as we go through. But let's start off with the rewilding theme. And before I do that, I want to say something up front. Um, I think it's wrong to say a lot of people are being very anti-agile at the moment. And I think one of the ways that you know that somebody had little integrity at the start, to be honest, is where they try and pretend they were always talking about agility, not agile. I mean, there is a sort of fashionista thing here, right? In that people, yeah, if you know the Kinks song, yeah, they're following the fashion, yeah, at any one stage. And I might as well, I'm in a pre-Christmas mood on this. Steve Downing is a great example of this. So, for example, he writes a book on which leadership storytelling is the future of the world. Then it becomes radical leadership. Then it becomes Stoos. Then it becomes agile. And now it's the networked economy. And each of those books uses exactly the same examples in exactly the same companies and has exactly the same statements, which says this is the future and everybody's adopting it who's successful. And I think that model is problematic. And a lot of the people who made their early money out of training and facilitation in Agile are now basically saying they were nothing to do with Agile in the first place. They're all about agility, etc., etc. Yeah. The reality is, if you go back to Snowden when it started, it has radically changed the way we develop software and the way we think about the world. Ken, particularly on Scrum, was the first person to actually bring complexity into a management framework on a scalable basis. And he deserves a huge amount of credit for that in terms, I mean, they now use Cynefin rather than Stacy Matrix, which I think is better. But yeah, fundamentally, he still brings complexity into play for the first time, and I think really understood some of the implications of it. So there was a huge amount of which came out of Snowbird, which was really important. It was fairly male dominated. There are stories about women who were uninvited and God knows what else, but I'm not getting into that. But fundamentally, if you go back to Snowbird, there were three inputs. One was DSDM, and I was one of the three founders of that several years before. We did it between competitors in a pub in Cheltenham over dinner. We didn't need a ski resort, but that's another matter. You then had XP, which is very much, and with apologies to Alistair here, the heart of Agile is what Agile was really about. The trouble with XP is it's insufficiently codified and insufficiently abstracted to actually scale in any way whatsoever. Whereas the third element, Scrum, was at exactly the right level of abstraction and codification so that actually you could scale around that. And I would say that, I mean, DSDM didn't have enough influence over the manifesto when it came out, in my view. XP was the heart of it, but Scrum was the thing which made it famous. If it hadn't been for Scrum, nobody would have heard of Agile.
You
It would
mentioned
just,
maybe just to sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned Ken. I'm assuming you meant Ken Schwaber.
yeah, I did.
What are your thoughts? I mean, like I agree, like in a sense, Ken and like especially the way that he created CSM class, and like I think even Jeff alone wouldn't contributed as much to this movement that we know as much as Ken. Um, Based on where we are now, what are your thoughts as far as you said there's some good stuff that has happened? Where do you see, and there's a lot of people shedding all over agile and everything. Where do you think we're going to be moving in the next couple of years?
Let me come on to that, Mijan. Yeah, I'm working up to that. Yeah, but I need to put some building blocks in place before I respond to that question. Yeah. So, and if you don't know Brasso's work, Max Brasso's work, Knowledge Assets and the I space, which is one of the origins both of Wardley maps and of Cynefin, they both come from that original framework. He basically says you have to have the right level of abstraction and right level of codification for anything to diffuse quickly. Yeah. And the trouble with XP is rather like a London taxi driver, in that it's 2.5 years training. The hippocampus has to physically change shape, and it's a very complex process, and it's very much tacit. It's very much implicit. Whereas Scrum is the equivalent of a map. It's all worked out, it's laid out, you can learn the map, you can navigate with it, it's a structured. And that was Brasso's point. Maps scale, taxi drivers don't. But taxi drivers have deeper knowledge and more adaptability within the system. So what then happened is that the Scrum model, which was open source, and let's be fair on Ken on that, he went open source, that was all published. And the other point I'd make, Megan, as well, that Ken was a programmer, Jeff wasn't, and that's significant. Yeah, if you look at what then happened to Scrum after that. As that started to spread, the Scrum model of making money out of training and certification became the thing that everybody else seized on. And that ranges from authentic material, and Scrum is authentic on that, it comes from an originally body of knowledge, to more recent attempts, which have, I gather, just been abandoned, to take things like Spotify and then rebadge them and sell training courses around them. So this sort of, why don't we sell training and why don't we sell certificates rather than contribute to software development was a key issue. And of course, the real trigger point where we all knew that Agile as a movement was over when was SAFe arrived. Because what SAFe did is it commodified Agile. And one of the things you know if you work in corporate strategy, and I've been in corporate strategy all my life, is when a dominant movement becomes a commodity, it's about to end. So hardware, for example, dominated IT until it became a commodity, then it didn't. Then software dominated IT until it became a commodity, then it didn't. So this is a common pattern. Yeah. And SAFe, in effect, was the Scrum method on speed. And to be brutal about this, if anybody wanted anything, Dean would happily sell you a certificate in it, I think is probably the best summary of SAFe. Yeah. And the diagram always reminds me of a sort of, the sort of engineer's model of a petroleum refining plant, right? And it's got those sort of characteristics about it. It's not an organic system, it's a highly structured engineering system. And that was when some of us said, okay, well, the spirit of Agile is there. We now need to start to rethink this, right? And this happened some time ago. Now, we'd already been working within Cynefin on what are called pre-Scrum methods. In Cynefin terms, Scrum is a brilliant method for moving things from complex to complicated. That's what it does well. It does it through rapid linear iteration. It allows some variation on that, and that's a complex to complicated switch. In Cynefin terms, it's liminal complex. It's not a complex technique because there's not enough, it's not fragmented enough, it's not granular enough, and it doesn't work enough in parallel. So we developed 3 methods on this, and I'm going to illustrate this. This is our Tyner approach. One was entangled trios, in which instead of sending out a systems analyst to interview people, because to be quite honest, if you know the famous thing about the radiologists who do not see a picture of a gorilla in an X-ray, we only see what we expect to see, and analysts have preformed an opinion before they interview people. If you want the science on this, if you conduct more than 2 interviews, you form a subconscious hypothesis, and thereafter you only pay attention to things that match that hypothesis, and you can't train yourself not to do that. Yeah, so that's kind of like reality. So we take experienced systems architect or end system tester, somebody who's older with experience of whole systems, put them together with young, naive, just out of college, bright programmer. And then the third member of the trio is a user trained to talk to IT people. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to understand users. There's all sorts of reasons for that associated with neurodiversity in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And then we throw 15 trios at a problem rather than sending out one person to conduct interviews. And those trios build prototypes and experiment with things. So we're engaging users not through a representative of the users, but through multiple users. And then at the end of, say, a month or so, we synthesize the results of all those trios into a specification. But we've also had the benefit of building informal networks between users
Molly,
and people.
ciao.
Okay. So that's one example. The other thing we've done a lot of is to map unarticulated needs. So that's basically gathering stories of people's day-to-day frustrations on a longitudinal basis at scale over the whole workforce, and identify patterns in those problems, and then use existing IT solutions to provide proper solutions to those problems. So that's trying to make IT more strategic in terms of solving problems which you haven't yet been told about. Yeah, as long as you're just taking a manufacturing framework and developing what you need to develop, that's not going to produce the same result. And the third one, which we focused on, was, and this was an old DSDM method, in that I was one of the early adopters and promulgators of rapid application development. And one of the things we did on that was basically run very intensive workshops over 1 or 2 days, in which we brought users together with IT people, and it's called JAD Workshop. We actually built a prototype of the system in 1 or 2 days working with the users. And that's actually quite important because users don't know what they want until they see it, and then they want something different. Technology can do things that users don't understand. And I always used to argue that data flow diagrams and entity models were designed by our industry in order to actually make users sign up to things they didn't understand, but we could hold them accountable for later. So we went down a sort of JAD route, and it became everything we did, to be honest, as a company. This was data sciences. We would actually run a 2-day JAD session to actually produce a $12 million bid for the stock exchange, which we won at the end of the session by interacting with the users rather than having a traditional requirement procurement process. So that became, and we codified that. It's a method within the framework. So either way, we were doing this on a defense contract, and I'd started to run JAD sessions around the world because we were on tight timeframes. So I'd take the advantage of 8-hour time zones. So I'd start a workshop in the UK, pass it over to India, then pass over the results to California, then bring the results back into the UK the next day. Yeah, so I could literally rotate and develop the ideas. And one day I forgot to send over the original requirement. I just sent the output of the JAD session we run in Farnborough. I sent the output of that, but forgot to send over the initial specification. Then I remember waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning and thinking, oh shit, I'm in trouble. But there isn't anything I can do about this now, so I'll just wait and see. Got in the next morning to find the users around the screen saying, oh my God, we would never have thought of that. Can we please have it? And it turned out what had happened. We were lucky it went to Mumbai first, to be honest, because they just said, okay, we haven't got the spec, but we'll do what we can with it. It went to San Francisco and they said, well, we're not going to do it because we haven't got the spec. And Mumbai said, well, we managed, can't you? And that provoked them. And what we did that accidentally on that was introduce effectively rapid mutation. Nobody knew what the input was, but they modified the output. And that we now call AAA. That's a really powerful method because in biological terms, it introduces mutation into the design specification, and you can do that in parallel. Now, I give those three as illustrations because there's no point in us developing something which replaces Scrum because Scrum does what it does. Whether Scrum and Kanban are the same thing or not, I leave open. There's a famous phrase from Tolkien, this is the elves putting down hobbits, that to sheep, other sheep appear different, or to shepherds. But we have made no study of men, right? I mean, that's an elf put down, which I've always rather liked, right? So when this started to happen, and the other big thing I developed in IBM was the hexy concept. So we'd taken all of our methods and tools and broken them down, and this is a complexity concept, into what's called the lowest level of coherent granularity. And a classic mistake a lot of people make is to think that reductionism is breaking things down. It isn't. Reductionism is assuming that the properties of the whole can be deduced from the parts. Breaking things down makes a hell of a lot of sense. So what we did, so for example, well, I'll give you an example in a minute. So what we've got there is three methods, right? Scrum is a collection of methods. I'll leave on one side whether it's a framework or not. I don't think it is. I think it's a very useful collection of methods with a coherent philosophy behind it. But that's the philosopher in me wanting words to be used more precisely, right? But there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't peel out a 2-week sprint and replace it with a 3-month time box. And that's my point about granularity. So what we've now done, and we've agreed this with scrum.org, and we've agreed it with the Yax DSDM, and we're working with team topologies and others, we've already done it ourselves, is to break any method or framework down into its lowest coherent parts. And by the way, this will be software as well as there'll be three different software approaches to this. One is ours, the other is Ivor Jacobson, and the other is just use Miro. Now, we actually want competition in this space. And this is an open source initiative. So when people are running a project, what they effectively do is put together methods and tools from multiple vendors at a much more finely grained level. And what comes out of that is an assembly which you can store and reuse or modify. If anybody walks, and my hobby is walking, if you look at a mapping app like Outdoor Active, I can, when I'm in an area, say anybody else walk this area, I can pick a route, but then I can modify the route. Right? So that's the sort of principle we're doing. Anybody else worked in this area? Well, this is how they assemble different methods. I'll take that as a starting point, but then I'll make modifications. And that's the complexity principle of you scale by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation or repetition. And I'll repeat that because it's key. You scale by decomposition and recombination, not by repetition or imitation. Yeah, and that was the first reason, the first time I ever saw SAFe, I remember in Novi Sad. I said, that's not how you scale a complex system. By definition, it's wrong a priori. I couldn't care less about the methods. You don't scale by just simply putting things together and repeating what you did last time. Or particularly in the case of SAFe, half-remembered projects which Dean ran once in his life. Sorry, I'm being sarcastic here. But that's a pretty accurate description of where SAFe came from, right? So from my point of view, I think that's the next level of Agile. And that's what we talk about rewilding. I often show a slide on this. If you look at a picture of a wolf, it's one of about 5 or 6 types of wild canine. If you look at domestic dogs, yeah, then the number of types of dog after 7 generations, you get huge amounts of diversity with non-viable species. So rewilding is kind of like, let's go back to some of the originals. Let's find recombinations. Let's get away from the framework walls. Let's recognize that all of these tools and frameworks have value in parts. Yeah. And let's find ways in which we can put them together. Yeah. So that we don't get into the framework wars and we don't get into another lock-in like SAFe. So that's the big initiative. Yeah. So there's a video on this that we announced with Scrum. Patricia and I did that with Nigel Thurlow. We'll announce the software probably in February. We're collaborating with Ivor Jacobson on Essence. That's a different approach. But we can take his stuff across into Hexi at practice level. So we're definitely trying on this to say, let's break the framework wars, let's break the proprietary approach. But let's find ways to codify things at a level where people can use them quickly without having the huge expertise that lies behind something like XP. So codify at the right level of granularity, allow recombination. That's kind of like the approach we're taking. Yeah. The other thing, and I'll finish after this, is it's very important to map 3 things. Yeah, I'll talk about agency in a second. First is you need to understand the environment in which you're operating. And this is something we launched a year or so ago called S-Drive mapping. What that does is it identifies all the things in the environment you can change or potentially change, either act as constraints or constructors. It then maps them onto a grid between the energy cost of change and the time to change. And then, of course, anything top right in that grid is the time or the energy cost of change is too high. So it's not going to change. And what that allows us to do is to define the environment in which we can do anything anyway. And that, by the way, is a 2 half-day workshop that can be used to radically de-risk major IT projects. You first of all map what's called the environment, all right, or the affordances landscape, to see what can be changed before you decide what you should change. All right, so that's one thing. The other thing is the whole culture issue and the whole nonsense of mindsets and mental models, which was a cute concept in the 1980s, but people really need to grow out of it. There ain't such a thing as mental models, and there ain't such a thing as a mindset. Yeah, consciousness is distributed. So what we're also doing there is to map the underlying narrative patterns, yeah, which basically define the belief and attitude systems which prevent people seeing novelty or actually can be positive or negative. We just launched something on that with Lukshan on Gaping on Comic Agile. So basically, you choose one of six Comic Agile cartoons. You tell a story about why you chose it. You index that, and from that, we give you a pattern map. Yeah, this is fully automated, which basically shows you the attitudinal maps, which will determine how people respond to what you're trying doing. And then, if you want to change it, you don't say, I want this or that. You say, how can I get people to tell more stories like this and fewer stories like those? Yeah, and that's a nudge approach. Yeah. And the final thing I wanted to mention is the new work which we're launching next year on distributed agency. So if you look at evolutionary biology, and these roughly coincide with Dunbar numbers, but there's a better research base to them. The decision groups we evolved to make decisions in are sexual pairs, extended families, and clans. And if people are in a clan, they don't depart from clan norm because the clan has got to stay together, so people will conform. The maximum number of active decision makers in the extended family is 7. We evolved to compromise in groups of 7 or less. So I was just doing a workshop with the NHS in the UK. We had about ambulance drivers, consultant surgeons, nurses, hospital administrators. We had various tribes. Everybody wanted to work together, but in a big workshop, they won't depart from the tribal norms. When I took one person from each tribe and put them into separate groups, they came up with completely novel ideas. Yeah? So we're working with that. And the second thing we're working with is a thing called the panopticon effect. And if you know you're being observed, but you don't know who the observer is, you are more likely to be honest. Yeah, you mustn't know who the observer is because you can influence them. And so the work we're now doing is to say, well, look, if you can assemble these 4 roles or these 6 roles, and you accept a completely anonymous 5th or 7th role, it might be a committee, it might be an AI system, it might change. And if you agree to record context, decision, and consequence, yeah, and this is role-based decision making, then you can spend $1,000, spend $10,000 without actually asking for permission. And then the real investment will follow the ideas which work rather than the people who are good at saying what they can do to work. So we're trying to shift away from I am good at getting money for a project to if I can get together a group of people from these diverse rules and actually do small things at scale, the money can flow with things which actually work rather than things that people will say work. Yeah. That, by the way, on our initial estimates, we can take out 50% of the cost of bureaucracy in a hospital by an increased medical engagement and actually improved decision making. But the panopticon effect is key because that creates honesty. This actually is also a way of avoiding fraud. Now, we really want to move that into IT. So if you can assemble groups of users, groups of people from different IT backgrounds, and you can actually record something, you can start to build prototypes, you can start to experiment with new ways of working. And then the real investment will flow to the things which are working rather than to the over-specified, over-structured front. And I'll finish with this. Agile, in effect, became waterfall done at speed. The next generation is to break that linear concept completely, and that's what we're trying to do. So, high-level summary. Hopefully, I answered your question, Arjun, but now open for discussion.
All right, thank you, Dave. So I want to go back to maybe what I asked earlier, and based on what you also added after that. So if we're moving towards the space of breaking down these frameworks, understanding the essence of the practices and contextualizing those practices and patterns, where do you see the big consulting companies and how things will emerge, or what do you think is going to emerge from all of it?
That's an interesting. I mean, the other thing we're doing, I mean, Hexi is going to go into an open source proper consortium at some stage once we've got it started. We're committed to that. But one of the things we're saying up front is you can only produce a Hexi pack if you own the IP or if you've got a license from the IP holder.
Okay.
Right? So what Safe did, which is take everybody else's IP and bundle it to package, that won't work.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea is the Scrum hexes have been produced by scrum.org and so on. Yeah. Um, if I'm honest about it, this is designed to hit the big consultancies.
Mhm.
Yeah, because it's designed to bring together specialists in multiple fields in some sort of coherent framework. I think the big consultancies will adopt it because they've got a massive problem at the moment in their utilization models are not working. So they're having to drive utilization up to 80, 90%. You know, the minute your utilization goes above 60%, you've just destroyed your seed corn. You're eating your seed corn. But that's what their models are driving. And I think the future is now probably not such a big consultancy group, but smaller groups of consultants collaborating together. And I think the future of the big consultants, to be honest, is to hold the risk and the project management of that. And I think that's where they'll go. But to be honest, that's what I designed for IBM. If it hadn't been for Virginia Rametti, that would have been the IBM structure. IBM would be 10% of its current workforce, but deploying 500% of its capability. Because it would be managing the risk and the project with multiple specialists within a coherent framework. And I think that's the future.
All right. Let's open up to others. What other questions? Maybe put it in the chat or go off mute.
Okay.
Hi, Dave. Transparency,
Good and bad.
loved by the Agile community. However, my experiences, we as coaches or consultants have the impact of transparency in mind, but people in a setup environment know this will potentially break up some mechanisms. So it is a two-sided sword. So what can you?
Transparency is good or bad. If you have too
Yeah,
much transparency, you get no innovation. People won't take risks.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in IBM, the guy I worked for, his rounding error every quarter was $250,000. So if you only, so he could hide a lot and he innovated, right? And then IBM put in SAP and put in control, and he could no longer risk anything because everything had to be declared up front, and that destroyed innovation. On the other hand, if you have no transparency, you get corruption. So if you look what we're trying to do with the panopticon effect on small decision groups, is by having a completely anonymous actor in the system. Yeah, you're forced into more honesty, but you're actually transparent within that group. Yeah. So I think transparency is neither good nor bad. It's something that you adjust based on the context you're working in. Yeah. The other thing I'll say on the coaching market, the Estro map, the energy against time stuff, we're about to launch that for coaches. I'm talking about this in January. So instead of trying to change how people's mindsets or their inner develop or the inner outer nonsense, the sort of Jungian hangover, what you do is they identify who are the actors in their life, where are the constraints, what's the constructors like processes or rituals, what impact is that having on them, and then start to change those so that they change by changing their environment. So if anybody's interested in that, we're about to move that into the coaching market along with continuous journaling. So the concept is you move to changing the environment in which you work rather than trying to change yourself.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that as far as environment? During the last week's conference, we talked about organizational and business architecture. How would you define environment?
So we look at three things, and the collective name for these is actants. That goes back to actor network theory. So actants can be actors, i.e. they're people or roles or job functions, generally roles in an organization rather than individuals, occasionally an individual. If anybody's read the Foundation series, you can see Trump as the modern political equivalent of the mule. All right, I'll leave you to have a think about that one. I just and we just need a second foundation somewhere. I'm praying for that at the moment, having just come back from DC and a lot of depressed Democrats. But either way, so actors are people with people agency. Constraints either contain things or they connect things. Yeah. Constructors is a really interesting concept. It comes from quantum mechanics. This is Deutsch's work. A constructor is something which transforms things, but doesn't itself change substantially in the act of transformation. So a process, a ritual, a software object is actually a classic example of a constructor. And so what we're saying is you need to map those, actors, constraints, constructors. You need to identify the energy cost and the time to change. That allows you to identify what realistically you can't change and you've got to live with. And then you create strategies to change the energy cost so that if you want to change something, you can. Right? So that's kind of like one of the ways we're going on that. And really what we're saying is it's if you look at a complex adaptive system, you're always managing for emergence. Yeah. And that means there are only two things you can actually really change. One are the actants and the other are the interactions. Yeah. And that means you have to have monitors in place so you can see what's changing, so you can respond very quickly if good things happen and very quickly if bad things happen. And you need scaffolding or structure, which you know won't change. So the counterfactual area of an S-drive map is important because it's things you can rely on as not changing. Yeah, and you may want to move things there. That's called the Ames framework, right? In a complex system, that's all you can manage. Complexity is really very simple. Yeah, because there's a limited amount of things you can play with. But the architecture, sorry, come back to the architecture. I think one of the things I'm really keen to do at the moment is to define a crew, which is one of these role combinations, as an object. So, and I argued this in Corba committees back in the 1980s. I said people are objects too. So your software architecture should be able to have software objects and people objects. Where you've got ambiguity, you leave it to a people object, and then you see how the people object deal with it before you codify. That means that about 90% of the grief on large software projects is caused by 10% of the project. So you put that 10% into human objects rather than software objects, and that reduces your risk as well. And I think that's where architecture gets exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've used this concept of cooks and chefs. I think I've used it in previous conversations. Based on everything that you've said so far, even though, yes, complexity management should take everything with the, or look at it from how do we not necessarily simplify it, but how do we actually I guess not simplify, but there are simple solutions to complex sometimes. My question is really around if we are contextualizing these practices, patterns, what are your thoughts as far as industry? There's a lot of, I'm guilty of it, training, and there's a lot of people out there. There are a lot of people that claim that they know complexity management, but we don't. And it seems like based on what you're saying, there needs to be some level of understanding around complexity management for what's coming. Maybe not, maybe that's where you're codifying those things, but what are you of understanding about complexity that's needed in order to implement or...
Complexity's become a buzzword. So it's quite interesting. I mean, everybody in systems thinking, and systems thinking is not the same thing as complexity science. Please don't confuse the two. So most people in systems thinking ignored complexity for years. Now, all of a sudden, all of their methods are about navigating complexity, right? And they don't understand it because you can't. VSM is not a complex systems model. It's an ordered model and so on. And God help us with systems dynamics, all right? Even the systems thinkers are embarrassed by that. So I think, and we've also got, KPMG had cutting through complexity as their slogan. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of people who've read a couple of books. And by the way, this is an agile disease. I've read a book I picked up in the airport. I'm now an expert on the subject, and I'm going to launch a certification in a neurological approach to agile. All right, I've caught somebody doing that. Yeah, I'm on the HR side. So there's people who haven't studied it, and also people who haven't understood the implications. I think that's the big thing. Complexity is a phase shift in the way we understand the world. And a lot of people doing is they're using the language, but then they're using traditional methods to try and deal with it. Yeah.
So I guess that's my question, or that's my question and concern. Like, is that important or not that we're doing that?
It's important, but you got to live with it. I mean, a lot of people get Cynefin wrong, and I sort of occasionally get sarcastic about people who say the 5 quadrants of Cynefin because it rather implies they've got a problem with their education. Yeah, it's rather like our former prime minister who said he wanted every school in Britain to be above average, which rather indicates his wasn't. Right. Um, and I think you need to tolerate a certain degree of that and occasionally, do things. But if you look at complexity at the moment, there are kind of like 3 major schools, all right? And when different schools emerge, that's significant. Yeah. So one is the computational school, which is Santa Fe. And if you haven't read Forrest's book Chaos, I would read that. That's on economics, because what he is saying quite rightly is you can't model a complex system. Yeah. The minute you say you've got a model for complexity, you ain't understood it because a model represents reality. All you can do is simulate, or what we do with the narrative software is we stimulate, the system at scale. And when you see patterns, then you can apply models to the patterns. Right. So that's, I would say 90% of people who use complexity don't understand that. Right? But the computational school actually is precisely that. It's about simulation. Yeah. You've then got the psychodynamic school, which is people like Stacy, Sonia Blicknote, who used to work for us, and others. They're really into the whole inner outer thing and changing individuals and wayfinding and all this sort of stuff. Sorry, I don't find that credible. They see complexity as existing in the eye of the beholder, which is a mistake a lot of systems people make as well. And then you got the anthro-complexity school, which is me and others, which is basically saying complexity is one science. We need to combine it with cognitive neuroscience. We need to combine it with things like assembly theory from the humanities. So complexity isn't the be all and end all of this, but we are taking a natural science approach, not a social science approach. And I think that's where and then you've got, let's say, people just picking up on the language, all right? They just like to use the language.
But don't you see that as going forward? That's what, like, if we think about what will organizations need in order to be successful, is what you're describing. But in reality, people are not doing that. So,
Sorry, and when the advantages about being 70, there are disadvantages like having to tape up your knees before you walk over mountains. All right. One of the advantages, you've seen a few things go round.
yeah.
I remember when systems thinking came out in the 80s, and I was actively involved in the LSE pod, and I was working on socio-technical systems, and everybody said, this is all bloody academic. It will never take off. And 3 years later, it totally dominated industry. It was the basis of business process re-engineering, Six Sigma, learning organization. And complexity is going through the same thing, and it's going to be messy for a bit, and people are going to misuse it. But the world is getting more complex. So just to depress you, right? So sometime in the next 10 years, we'll see the first mass human extinction event on a single day. It's either going to be India or Indonesia, Western Australia, or the southern United States. The temperature will go above 58 degrees, at which point everybody dies. I mean, everybody. The human can't shed heat fast enough, right? When that hits, and it is going to hit sometime in the next 10 years, the world is going to change. All right, the world is going to change with Trump. The world is inherently uncertain, and that's going to drive different ways of thinking and acting. The secret is, to be quite honest, I mean, I've had years of this, of people saying, well, why don't you just compromise a bit so it's more acceptable? And I'm saying, sorry, I'm going to not compromise on this because I want to be around when you all realize you were wrong, right? Which is slightly arrogant, but I'm going to stick with it, all right? And if you want to have a debate about this, I mean, it's like Chris Moles, all right, who's Ralph Stacey's inheritor. He will not have a conversation with anybody who disagrees with him. And there's far too many people like that at the moment. There's a lack of active debate. Everybody's views are equally valid. Everybody should be nice to everybody else. We need some heavyweight debates at the moment. Yeah, not ad hominem debates. But I'll also say that too many people in Agile think if you criticize what they say, you're criticizing them. That's not the case. Yeah, an ad hominem is a personal attack on the individual. It's not an attack on what they say is legitimate. Although using irony on Americans is a deadly weapon, I've got to stop doing it so often. All right, it's a cruel and unnatural punishment.
What about anybody else? Kurt, or I don't know if there's anybody else. You already asked the question. Maybe let's do one more from you and then see if anybody else has any other question. So go ahead, Kurt, and then we'll see if
I think you made a very important point. Let's have debates, real debates, and this is what we need to do and get out of this political correctness to really exchange arguments, respect positions, try to understand other positions, and that's essential for us in consulting and trying to help organizations. What can you share as wisdom for how to stay to your true self and foster productive, true debate?
Okay, so the best thing that ever happened to me educationally is at the age of 11, I went up to what was then called a grammar school. In those days in the UK, we split people into academic and not academic at the age of 11, which had benefits and negatives, yeah? And we were allowed to wear long trousers for the first time. I still remember that. You hit 11, you could wear long trousers. If you had to walk 2 miles to primary school in the British winter in 1966, it was bloody awful if you had to wear shorts, all right? But I still remember walking to the front of the class on Friday and being given a card by the teacher, and it said, "You support capital punishment." Now, my mother was at that time leading the Labour Party campaign in North Wales against capital punishment, so the teacher has been a bit wicked here. But I had to speak for 7 minutes for something I totally disagreed with without preparation. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. Yeah? Now, I use that as an example of a process which generated behavior. So nobody tried to teach us to be critical. Nobody tried to teach us to be generalists. But because we had to argue for things we don't believe in every week, we learned to be hypercritical. We learned to be able to handle an argument, and we read everything because we didn't know what we were going to get hit with. And I'll make that point very strongly. We need more processes which generate behavior rather than people trying to mandate the behavior. No? Now, people aren't used to that. And the other point you've got is, at the moment, the algorithms in social media reward clickbait. And I mean, I don't do it as much as I should do, but I quite like calling out clickbait articles, right? Particularly ones with 2 columns with terribly evil things on the left and terribly wonderful things on the right that, of course, you will acquire if you just pay me some consultancy fees. Yeah. Particularly most of the stuff on the left is, yeah, and that don't get me there, right? So at the moment, there are some people who put up really interesting stuff on social media. They link to material, you can have a debate. There are some people who are just playing clickbait to get traffic. We need more people to call out the clickbait, particularly now that AI is generating a lot of it. Yeah.
Lee, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Dave. Thinking about what you've been discussing about rewilding Agile, joining this session is a little bit of a therapy session for me because my business is, the company I work for is going through a large Agile transformation, which doesn't particularly feel Agile at all for me. It feels very much like some of the things you've been talking around consultancies, bringing in large off-the-shelf structures that aren't safe, but they are safe with some labels changed, etc. Implementing these fixed, rigid methods, complex methods, or complicated methods. Notice I say the word methods, not methodology.
Thank you for doing that. Do that. Methodology is a study of methods, guys. It's not. Yeah. Go on.
So what I see is a lot of time, effort, and money going into implementing these big behemoths, and the potential for sunk cost fallacy in, well, we've spent all this money, so it must be the right thing we should be doing. Let's continue. When the next shiny thing comes along that the business start trying to implement, how do you see turning people to rewilding techniques rather than just going for the next off-the-shelf?
I think you'll always get people do that. If you look at market life cycle, yeah, kind of like you get, the early adopters are all like bloody pain, or because they just like novelty. Yeah, and whoever commands the early majority phase commands the rest of the market. So there will always be people who are doing what everybody else is doing, and that was Dean's genius, by the way. because he built SAFe off three things. One is creating something which looked like it was agile, but wasn't agile, but was actually traditional. So that made IT directors happy. Secondly, it was going to take at least 3 years to implement and cost several $1 million. C-level people love those because they can move on before the consequences are known. And third, he had a Ponzi scheme. And if you did the 4-day course, you could teach the 3-day course without any experience or whatever, right? So to be quite honest, Dean was brilliantly exploited, the inauthenticities around software development and corporate life. And the big consultancies do the same. Nobody gets fired for implementing McKinsey's report. But my point is that isn't going to be sustainable for much longer. And remember, the big consultancies rose on the back of business process re-engineering, and the business schools rose on the back of the big consultancies. It's only a four-decade-old phenomenon. And everybody keeps criticizing Taylor. Nobody's bloody read Taylor. They're not criticizing Taylor. They're criticizing systems thinking. I mean, I taught leadership with Drucker, and we basically said, look, Taylorism and complexity theory have got a lot in common because they automate what you can automate, and everything else is about human judgment and apprentice models. It was and the military metaphor, which underpinned Taylorism, is highly adaptive, whereas the engineering metaphor, which dominated systems thinking, is non-adaptive. Right. So I think what you're going to see is, and when these phase shifts happen, there are casualties in the process. Now, one of the things we are doing, I can't talk too much about who we're doing this with, but it's some of the players, is to produce a safe recovery kit. So what you do is you take all the hexes from the vendors who originally generated the method and say what you actually used in your safe implementation. And then you tag it as to what worked or what didn't work, and then you modify it. So now you can say SAFe was the Trojan horse by which we got Agile in, but now we're going to develop it, because nobody's going to admit that SAFe failed. That was the fourth thing Dean realized. If you spent millions of dollars on something, it will never, ever be allowed to fail. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things we're starting to look at, but also, because the software environment is changing. I mean, a lot of people are going to fall into the AI trap, and then they'll become more stable. They'll be less original. Yeah. It's interesting. The elite American schools are now removing technology from the classroom, so the kids of the tech giants have advantage over the people who've actually learned with technology. Yeah. It's very significant now, because you need to develop human abductive skills rather than inductive skills.
Thank you.
Kurt, there are a few questions in the chat, but if you could go off mute and just ask them, maybe. We got 10 more minutes, but Kurt, you have
picking up this last statement on a safe recovery kit. Dave, we've talked about this in Paris, and you presented this idea, but you don't expect to get an approval from Scaled Agile for this. You will get people from the safe SPC areas. I'm very interested in this, but I don't expect that safe is Scaled Agile is accepting to talk about how many of those implementations.
No, they won't. I mean, it's why there are GitHub sites with all the failures actually recorded on them, which you could access if you go look, right? No, I think the people who've made their money off SAFe, I think they're basically, I mean, to use the classic metaphor, they're dinosaurs. They're still going to be around for a bit. But companies need to move on. So complexity says start with where people are, not where you would like them to be. Right, well, where they are is they just spent a fortune on SAFe. So telling them they were wrong is probably a mistake. Yeah, saying what did you actually use and what didn't you use and how can we help you move forward, that's sensible. Yeah, and that's what we're working on. And in a sense, that's really saying, look, Agile, you can almost say Agile got the granularity wrong. It chunked things together too much rather than keeping things separate. Now, XP did that. XP always had its practices as separate. Yeah. But again, nobody codified it to the point where it was scaled. So we're codifying the fragments. So if we go back to the chef metaphor, the hexes are the ingredients with their characteristics defined. So you can put the ingredients together in different combinations. Yeah. So you have the level of knowledge of somebody who's cooking from scratch. You've got the
thoughts on how similar is that to what PMI tried to do with discipline agile? Like in some way, I'm not as familiar, but I don't know if you are, but they tried to do something similar to that, right?
PMI did two mistakes. All right. First of all, they decided they would enter the market by trying to compete directly with SAFe. That was a mistake.
Yeah.
Then they bought the shallow way, which was a major mistake. Most appropriate named person in the whole of the Agile community. And then they brought Dad, all right, but they didn't give Scott the room to do what Dad was about, and they tried to make it into a SAFe, and that was always going to fail, and now they're in a mess. Right? So that doesn't surprise me much. Yeah,
But the original
it's
idea
basic. You do not compete with an apex predator by trying to do what the apex predator does.
yeah.
That doesn't work. PMI made that fundamental error.
But what are your thoughts of Scott's, or not how PMI, I guess, implemented, but Scott's idea of how he approached discipline agile?
I think he was on the right pathway. And I don't blame him for selling to PMI because it wasn't. If you look at it, I mean, I had dinner with Craig a couple of years ago in Warsaw. I mean, he's not really advocating less anymore. It's his partner who's doing that. So if you look at the frameworks, all right, Dad, less were much closer than SAFe in terms of because they allowed more variety in the system. But again, I think they were still taking a modular approach and an assembly approach rather than a complexity approach and an emergent approach. And that's the bigger switch.
Great. Serge, you have your hand up. There are a few questions in the chat, but sorry, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to them. But I'm going first with people that are raising a hand and asking here. So Serge, if you could go off mute and ask your question. Maybe that's by mistake.
Muted, Serge. I think we've lost Serge.
Yeah. Yeah, phone not working. Okay.
I think just to pick up one of the questions in the chat, I think the key thing to understand is that AI works inductively. Humans evolved to think abductively. Right? That's a really important distinction. So inductive, basically, I mean, the other phrase, there's a wonderful paper on this. It said humans hallucinate, AI bullshits. Right? So humans have learned how to use imagination and hallucination and synthesis to handle conditions where there are no training data sets. That's why we survived as a species. AI is only based on its training data sets, and it's not going to break away from that. There was a book last time I was in the MIT bookshop, which is my favorite bookshop on the entire planet in Cambridge. And there was a book which I refused to buy because I don't want to encourage it, of which the title was Correlation is Causation. And what's fascinating is a lot of the AI guys, are actually arguing that if they get enough data, correlation is causation. And we've got a major problem in medical science at the moment because statistics matter more than physiology. Okay, that's behind the statin nonsense and things like that. So I think that the danger is, and I made this mistake once. I was at a conference in California, and somebody said, "What do you think about the singularity?" Yeah, which is part of that. And I said, well, if anybody believes in the singularity, their brain is probably ossified to the point where for them it may be possible. And I didn't realize Kurzweil was in the front row, so life got a little bit interesting, but I would stand by that statement. We are dumbing ourselves down by becoming over-dependent on AI. And there are things which AI does better than us, but if we don't learn to do them, we never develop the higher capacities anyway. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I use it. It's a great search engine. Yeah. Anybody who says it's going to save the planet when it's making probably a bigger contribution to global warming than the aerospace industry is at the moment is quite scary. But the basic problem is, and I'll make that point, it bullshits. It's trying to tell you what is the most probable thing. So I'll give you my favorite illustration. I asked it the other day, what is Dave Snowden's opinion on this? Something I'm writing an article on. It got it really badly wrong. When I said this is an article Dave Snowden is right, what will be the objections? It got the objections absolutely spot on. Because the objections were going to come from summarizing conventional thinking. So the minute anybody says AI has made me more productive, you should question whether they were doing the right thing in the first place.
Right. definitely food for thought. So, Dave, we got a few minutes. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I appreciate.
On the academic one, because the trouble is academic life has become a machine. So, I mean, and I'll give two examples. I may actually finally get around to doing a PhD in the next couple of years. I'm negotiating with the Humboldt because I can turn up and present a thesis, provided I've got 3 sponsors, without going through any study process. Because then it's a test of originality. These days, in order to do a PhD, you have to conform with the norm in your profession. So a PhD is one way to destroy originality, which is rather ironic. Yeah, my daughter won, University Prize for anthropology, right? The essence of that essay she wrote at master's level was in a first-year undergraduate course where she didn't get a good mark, but she wasn't writing to the marking scheme. She was, say, doing something original. And I think that's the problem. We've put the whole of education into a process-based engineering model rather than a human model, and it's no surprise that AI has picked up from that.
Yeah. Do you see the pendulum swinging more towards?
Well, I hope it's not a pendulum. I think it's more synthesis. I mean, I've used AI all my life. I was, writing AI to help, in defense applications back in the 70s and 80s. All right. I mean, to be quite honest, there's nothing that new in the algorithms. It's just the processing power and the training data, which has really changed. So this stuff is useful, but the whole point, I'll make this about it, the point about a tool is you pick it up, it should fit your hand. You shouldn't have to re-engineer your brain to fit the tool. Yeah. And the problem at the moment is most of the AI is being driven by a sort of, bunch of West Coast, early middle-aged males who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which for me is grounds for commitment to a mental hospital. So the cultural bias of the AI community is actually part of the problem in that they genuinely believe the world is based on their algorithms.
That is scary, in terms of what you just said. And Dave, we're at time. As always, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. Thank you for those of you that joined. Sorry for last week. They had some issues, and I'm glad that we created some more time for those of you that could rejoin and listen. The session has been recorded, so I'll upload it to my YouTube channel for those that missed. And till next time, thank you again, Dave, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
All right. Any final words, Dave, before I close here?
No, not really. I mean, I put a link in. I wrote a blog post recently. Next year is our 21st anniversary of the founding of the company.
Nice, congrats.
And that's not bad. 21 years, we've built a software business without investment. Not many people can say that. Yeah. And we've actually got some end of year offers, which I've just put a link on that. If anybody wants to play with the narrative mapping, the stuff we're doing with Comic Agile, there's some links for that. That's a really fast sub £1,000 quick way into using narrative. So there's a few things there which may be of interest. Okay.
Great. Thank you. I'll include the links in the video and also put in the email for those of you that couldn't attend. So thanks again, Dave, and thank you everyone who was able to join. Hope to see you again soon.
Bye all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.